Hey y'all, so today I'm going to be reviewing my favorite standalone novel of all time, And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie, and the recent BBC adaptation of the book. So this most recent adaptation of Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None was aired in December and is composed of 3 episodes, each of which are a full hour long. So I believe that this adaptation's premiere in the US was back in March on Lifetime, and I think that instead of breaking it up into 3 episodes that were each an hour long, I think that it was broken up into 2 episodes, presumably each was an hour and a half long, but I'm not entirely sure how those were broken up. I actually was able to watch the series while I was in England back in January because the episodes were streamable in England, and I meant to film and upload this video about the time that it was going to premiere in the US, and I tried to keep up to date with looking online and trying to see when it was going to premiere, but somehow the premiere just completely went off my radar and I totally missed it. So I'm finally making this about 2 months after it actually premiered in the US. Oops. Anyway, first I'm going to talk about the book and do a review for it, and then I'm going to get into the BBC series and talk about my opinions on it. So as stated, And Then There Were None is one of my absolute favorite books of all time. It's my favorite standalone novel of all time, and I just absolutely love it. And I was really excited to find this version of the book with the BBC adaptation cover on it while I was in England, and I could not pass up the chance to get that while I was there. So the premise of And Then There Were None, if you're not familiar with it, is that 10 strangers are invited to an island. Not long after they arrive, this mysterious voice echoes throughout the house, accusing them of these horrendous crimes, and then one of them dies. They begin to realize that one among the 10 of them has actually invited them all there and plans to systematically and very meticulously murder them one by one. And honestly, for me, it's really difficult to actually do a review of this book because I read it for the first time 6 or 7 years ago, and ever since then, it has just become so close to my heart and so important to me, and it's very hard to actually do a review of it. Honestly, this is about as difficult for me as it would be to review the Harry Potter series. I just love it so much that it's difficult to explain exactly why I love it. But I'm going to try. One of the key things that I really love about this book is what I like to call the hidden traitor trope. And what I mean by this is that we're seeing all 10 of these characters and we're learning all about them, but one of them is this traitor who is killing everyone, and they have this whole other dimension that we don't get to see, and we're basically trying to figure out through the entire book. And this trope is honestly one of my absolute favorite things in any sort of medium. I love when one person is secretly working against everyone else, and I love trying to figure out who that is. And that trope is done so insanely well in this book. Agatha Christie allows you to see inside the minds of pretty much every character. I can't think of a character that you don't get to see the thoughts of, and yet she still manages to keep you on your toes and keep you guessing and keep you in the dark about who this murderer is. And on top of this, the book is just very intricately and expertly crafted. There's always something happening that keeps the suspense up, or that throws a wrench into whatever thoughts you had about who may or may not be killing everyone. The characters are also one of the strongest aspects of this book. They're all very different and they all have very distinct personalities. And they all have very important and very detailed and interesting backstories, all of which are revealed in very interesting ways throughout the story. And despite how incredibly flawed these characters are, there are certain of them that you inevitably find yourself rooting for. And then of course comes the reveal and the ending, which honestly I think is the most genius aspect of the book. Because I remember the first time I read this, overall I really enjoyed it, but it wasn't until the reveal at the end and the explanation of some of the stuff that happened that I was really impressed. Because that's really when you start to understand why all of this happened and how all of it happened, and it's just so complex and intricately woven, and this mystery is just amazing. So obviously, since this is my favorite standalone of all time, this gets a full 10 out of 10 stars from me. So now moving on to the BBC adaptation. And before I start reviewing the actual adaptation, I wanted to give you some backstory on some of the past adaptations just to show you why this adaptation is so important to me. So obviously, since I have loved this book for several years, I have searched out adaptations of the book and tried to watch them. And there are definitely a lot of adaptations of this book, whether it be in older BBC series or in film, or I think there are also video games of it. There are just a lot of adaptations of this book. But for this, I'm just going to be focusing on the movies because these are the ones that I have kind of searched out the most. However, one key factor is the stage production made in 1943. Agatha Christie did write the script for the stage production, but there are some significant differences from the book. I believe that one or two character names were changed just because of some things happening at the time, and most importantly, the ending was changed. And obviously I'm not going to say what happened in the different ending or how the original ending was changed, but I do need to make a note that this new ending dramatically changed the entire tone of the story. And the reason that this is important is that it carries over into film adaptations. So currently there are 3 film adaptations in English of And Then There Were None. The first of these was in 1945 and it was called And Then There Were None. I have seen part of this. I started it and I didn't finish it because this was the first one that I tried to watch and there were significant changes made. If I remember correctly, because it's been a while since I've tried to watch this, at least half of the characters' names were changed. And that's definitely more than was changed in the stage production, and I don't know if there was actually any reason for it. And on top of this, the ending was changed to match the stage production's ending, which, like I said, drastically changes the tone of the entire story. And I'm going to be very honest here, I didn't finish the movie. I watched, I think, 15 minutes of it, and I was fed up with it. Honestly, I was upset at the changes to character because not only were some characters' names changed, but their entire personality was different. And I just was not in the mood to watch something that was diverting that much from the original story. So then 20 years later in 1965, a second film adaptation was made entitled 10 Little Indians. And once again, being completely honest, I have not seen this adaptation because I have read a little bit about it and I've heard a lot about it, and I am aware that I will just hate it because a ton of stuff in this is changed from the original book. This is definitely the English language adaptation that has the most changes because not only is the ending changed to match the stage production, but the character names are changed. There are some completely different characters than the ones that are in the book, and the plot is different. It's just, there are so many changes that it barely is And Then There Were None. Like, you could say that it was kind of inspired by And Then There Were None, but it just lacks a lot of the actual book in the movie. And then finally, the most recent English language film adaptation is And Then There Were None from 1974. This is the one that I got the furthest into, although I will once again admit that I have not seen the entire thing. Instead of on an island, they are in the middle of the desert, stranded by themselves. There are, once again, different characters that were not originally in the book, and some of their deaths were different, if I remember correctly. It was more reminiscent of the book than some of the previous adaptations, but still enough of a change that I just could not appreciate it. In fact, the film that has come the closest to actually doing the book justice is a Russian film made in 1987. I'm not going to try to pronounce the movie's title, partially because I would butcher the Russian, and partially because it includes some racial words that I am not comfortable with saying, but I've seen part of it and it's a pretty good adaptation, but I've just been missing out on a good English language version of And Then There Were None. One that is both true to the book and where I don't have to watch subtitles just to understand what's going on. And that for me is why this BBC adaptation is so important to me, because for once, an English language version has done the book justice. Is it an exact replica of the book? No. But it's a really good adaptation. I think the main thing here for me is that nothing has been changed. Nothing has been altered about the plot, the characters, or the setting. They are on an island, the characters have the same names and backstories as they do in the book, and the ending is basically the same as in the book. There are things that are added to make it more dramatic for the screen, which maybe 5 years ago I would have been upset by, but I understand why it needs to be done to make it more interesting for screen. But it's just such a good adaptation. Like, I've seen it twice now and I'm still so impressed with it because finally something has done justice to this beautiful book. By no means is it perfect because there are definitely a couple things I would have tweaked here and there, but as far as adaptations of this book go, it is at the very tippy top. It is so good. I also really like the way that the characters' backstories and their flashbacks were handled throughout the series. I think that in certain times they were really creepy and very morbid, which I really liked, but at other times they were also just really informative and they were handled in a really interesting way. Now, when I think back to the book and the adaptation and the differences between the two, there are really three differences that stand out the most to me. So I'm going to talk about each of these very briefly and very non-spoilery, and why, even though I want this to be as true of an adaptation as possible, these don't bother me very much. So the first of these is kind of the way that two characters interact with each other. So if you have seen the adaptation and read the book, you definitely know what I'm talking about, but if you are in the dark right now, I hope to keep you there. But basically, I think that the reason that I only have a very tiny, mild problem with it is that, once again, I think that it makes it more interesting for screen the way that they did it in the miniseries. I think the miniseries picks up on the hints throughout the book, and that since it is a more modern adaptation, it's allowed to do things that probably weren't quite as acceptable in the time of the book. So then the second difference is the scene that takes place either at the end of the second part or the beginning of the third part, where the characters are in the dining room and acting slightly out of character. I hope that is detailed enough for those of you who have seen it to understand what I'm talking about, and vague enough for those of you who haven't seen it to have no idea what I'm talking about, but that's about as much as I'm going to say about it. Let me know down in the comments if you're confused. And honestly, I just kind of liked the scene. I thought it was an interesting one for the screen. Is it in the book? No. But I thought that it was an interesting one to add to the series for the actual screen adaptation. And then of course, the last one is the way that the mystery is kind of unraveled. And this one doesn't bother me because I feel like it's the only way to be able to do it for a screen adaptation that makes it dramatic and interesting, because I feel like if it was done the way it was in the book, it would have probably confused some of the viewers and it just wouldn't have been as dynamic as it was in the adaptation. So I hope that those explanations of the differences made sense, but if they didn't, like I said, let me know down in the comments and I'll explain it further. So that's about it for my review of the book and the recent BBC adaptation. Obviously, I love the book a lot, and honestly, I just really think that this is the best adaptation of the book that I have seen. Let me know down in the comments your opinions on the book and the adaptation. As always, I will leave links down in the description to my blog, Twitter, and Goodreads. Please add me as a friend on Goodreads. I would love to be friends with all of you. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!